Okay, I guess we can start this webinar now. Hello, everyone. Good to speak to you, and I hope that you had a nice summer. And above all, I hope that you are all in good health. And yeah, it's good to see you. We're about 35 people in this webinar. I guess more people will be joining in a few minutes because we had about 80 people registered to this webinar. So which shows that there is some interest in knowing more about the future of emergency communications in EU legislation, and I'm here to explain to you what will happen in the years and the months to come here in Brussels, and how it will affect you, your work in the field of public safety, and more specifically on emergency communications. Well, now it's September, so back at work after the summer, and you might have noticed that at EENA this is the first of a set of many webinars that we will have until the end of the year, and you can actually check the list of our webinars on our website, and you just stay tuned also on your mailbox. We have also a new newsletter sent by my colleague Marta to inform you about all our upcoming webinars. So make sure to stay tuned and check what will be happening. So just to mention, so that I want this to be a very interactive discussion, and above all, I want this webinar to be very informative for you, and that you will learn things during this webinar, and that you will understand everything. So to do that, just feel free to ask as many questions as you want. I will try to answer them all. I cannot guarantee that I will have the response to all of your questions, but if I don't know, I will simply say it, and I can check myself a bit later and then get back to you by email. But it's important that if you have any question that you ask it. To do that, there is two possibilities. One is to ask. There's a possibility in this webinar tool to ask questions in a written way, and then another one is a possibility to raise your hands. To be honest, I prefer if you use the written questions, because it's just easier to see when you use this tool. It's not very easy to see when you raise your hand, so please use more the written questions, and then if needed, I can also give you the floor. But during this presentation, feel free to ask questions. I will try to respond to it either directly or at the end of the session or at the end of the webinar. And I just want to mention also that this webinar is being recorded, sorry, and the recording and the slides will be shared with you afterwards, I think tomorrow probably, and it will also be made available on our website, so you can always listen to it again afterwards, or find some more information in the slides. And to be fully transparent, I'm here with my two colleagues, Kasia Kotz and Staviana Community, who are also helping in this webinar. So thank you to you also to be there with me. So I guess most of you know me, but so I just want to recall a bit who I am. So I'm EENA's Public Affairs Manager. The words is just I'm the lobbyist of EENA, so I'm in charge of representing EENA to European institutions, mostly the European Commission and the European Parliament. I do many other things, but that's the core of my mission, is to help the decision makers with identifying the key problems on emergency communications, and try to influence the law so that it is fit for the emergency services, and to basically have a framework that helps the emergency services to save lives in the EU. So I joined EENA, I turned 5 a few days ago. It was on the 1st of September 2015 that I joined EENA, first as an intern, and then I found my way to become the face of public affairs for EENA. And so myself, my background is actually political science and EU affairs, so everything that is related to EU law. I did studies about that, and I'm also this kind of weird guy that you see sometimes at family dinners, who speak about the EU for many hours. So that's a bit who I am. So yeah, that's what the studies that I did, and then I learned more about the preoccupation of emergency services when I joined EENA. So that's it for the few words about me. I guess now we can jump with the contents of the presentation. Once again, feel free to ask questions at any moment. So first of all, I'd like to give some kind of introduction in which I will explain a bit how the EU works and what it is about, and to make sure that like you have the, let's say, the basics so that you can understand well the rest of the presentation, but also the communication that we do about legislation for the months to come. And what I'm going to present, I think it's very important that you master it and you understand it very well. So if you have any doubts, just feel free to write about that. So first of all, I'd like to recall a bit what we talk about in terms of country when we talk about the law of the European Union, because when you think about European cooperation, it's a bit blurry. It looks like that, and it's hard to understand a bit which countries are affected by what. So the legislation that I'm going to talk about, so it's mostly related to the EU single market, let's say, and so that concerns the member states of the European Union and of that square here that you see, the EEA, so it stands for European Economic Area, which includes Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. So put that in a map. That is where most of EU law applies. So of course, there are some few exemptions, and the countries that you see in green that are the members of the European Economic Area. They don't apply all the policies of the EU, but what I'm going to talk about is relevant for Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. You see that the UK is still in red because, well, though it's no longer a member of the European Union, but the EU law still applies there until the end of this year. So it is still a country in red in that map. Afterwards, I will have to update it. And I receive very often some questions about whether EU law applies also to overseas territories, because you know that some countries have territories that are not located geographically in Europe. And so the question is whether that applies to them. And so EU law applies to those 9 overseas territories that are for Spain, the Canary Islands, for Portugal, Madeira, and Azores, and the 5 French departments, French overseas departments that are Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guiana, Réunion Island, and Mayotte. Plus, EU law also applies to the French side of the island of Saint Martin. But there's a website on a web page on the website of the Commission where you can know more about the special status of certain territories and whether the EU law applies or not. So when you receive the slides, you can just click on it and you'll find you'll find all the information that you want. So just remember that EU law applies here to the member states of the EU plus the 3 countries of the EEA. And then I wanted also to speak about very briefly about the different levels of competencies, because we hear sometimes a lot of people saying, oh yeah, but the EU can do that and the EU should do that. Sometimes it's a bit more tricky because they don't always have the competence to act. So just want to mention that by the treaties, there are 3 different levels of competence of the European Union. There are first the exclusive competencies. There are very few exclusive competencies. So as the name suggests, is the competencies where only the EU can act on behalf of all the member states and can just negotiate treaties and negotiate agreements and pass legislation as much as they want in this level. And there are only 5 exclusive competencies. It's the customs union, the competition policy, the currency, the commercial policy, and the conservation of maritime biological resources. So it's very limited, and only in those 5 specific sectors the EU can do basically everything. Otherwise, we have either shared or supporting competencies. The shared competencies, you see here a few examples that are the competencies where the European Union does some kind of like coordination and really tries to give some influences to the member states' law, and the EU is here as like on top to give some orientations more. And then the member states can still pass some laws, and they still have the room for maneuver to implement it the way they want sometimes, and just to adapt it to the situation. And there's a long list of shared competencies, but it basically includes everything that is related to internal market. So that includes telecommunications, which we will see will be relevant for us. but that also includes consumer protection and transport and security and justice, etc. So there's a long list of shared competencies. Like there is also a long list and even longer list of supporting competencies, where the EU here just plays a role of bringing some added value when it's required. So when some cooperation between the countries is required, then the EU can do something, but otherwise it's mostly a competence for the member states, and that includes items such as civil protection or health. During the recent COVID crisis, we heard a lot of comments saying the EU should do that and that for healthcare and so on. It's not that easy because it's mostly a competence of the member states, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way it is, and so the national authorities keep the competence, and just the EU is here just to add something when it's needed. So it's not very easy. And actually, when we talk here about 112, we end up here in this quite tricky situation where we have the EU doing a lot in telecommunication sector because it's a shared competence, and so you have all this legislation that's saying that 112 should be routed to PSAPs and that people should be able to call 112 for free, and location information should be transmitted to emergency services and so on. So it's everything related to telecoms. But then the EU doesn't have the competence to tell the countries really how to organize themselves and how to handle such calls. So that is why we have sometimes this kind of non-parallel developments actually on emergency communications. So I think that's quite useful to make these points about the different levels of competencies of the European Union. Very briefly also, I'm going to recall a bit what are the three main institutions when we talk about decision making in the European Union, because sometimes there's a lot of confusion. So the most known institution of the European Union is of course the European Commission, which is here for mainly two things. First of all is to make sure that the EU law is correctly implemented. So it's the institution that will monitor what is happening in the countries and to make sure that the countries and the authorities do comply with what is said in the EU law. And also it's here to propose the new bills and to work on the preparation of new bills. So it will issue a proposal, and after which other institutions will discuss it. So it's the institution that is mostly composed of the EU civil servants, which are like usually experts in some topics, and there's a lot of staff who will work on some topics. But then once a bill is proposed, it is being amended and voted not by the European Commission, but by two other institutions that are the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. The European Parliament is composed of what we call the members of European Parliament, that are elected representatives. It's the ones who vote for every 5 years. So the last European elections were last year, and so that is for the composition of the European Parliament. And then we have the Council of the European Union, which is simply composed of the governments of all the member states. So we have these two institutions. One represents the citizens and the other represents the member states. And those two institutions, the Parliament and the Council, they vote the legislation and they can also amend it. So that is the three main institutions of the decision making in the EU, and that's a bit how they are working. And I'm just going to finish on this boring lecture on EU now with the different norms in the EU. I just want to make sure that you understand also the differences between the different norms that exist in the EU and the different type of legal acts. So the ones that is like, let's say, the most famous and that everybody knows and talks about the directives. So the directives that are binding. So when something is listed in a directive, it's usually obligatory for the member states. But what is interesting is that it requires some what we call transposition in the member states law. So that means that when a directive is voted, the directive will basically set some objectives saying member states should do that by this deadline. And so the directive just lists these objectives, and then the member states, they have some margin in defining how they will meet this objective and how they will apply those measures, basically. So typically there's a deadline of usually 2 years in a directive so that the member states can, let's say, translate the provisions into the national law. On the contrary, a regulation is self-executive. That means that the public authorities are not required, well, the national authorities are not required to do anything before it enters into force. It directly applies. Well, there's sometimes a deadline, but the national ministry should not vote any particular legislation or pass any particular national legislation. All the provisions are, of course, binding, but also they are directly implemented in all the national law of all the member states. So this is the main difference between the directives and the regulations, and it's very important to keep this difference in mind when you look at the EU legislation and what I will review afterwards. And then I'm going to pass very quickly on this, that there are some delegated and implementing acts that also exist. So these are like an accelerated procedure. It takes about 2-3 months to vote such acts, and it's just some measures it's a set of measures that just complete a legislation that already exists. So for instance, you have a directive that exists, and then after a while, the Commission can say that to better implement this directive, it's just a few sets of measures that can be adopted to just comply with the objectives in other legislation. So there's this accelerated procedure to basically better implement another legislation. So those are called the delegated or implementing acts. And also, very briefly, there are other types of legal acts. We will not really discuss that now, but there are decisions that are also binding, but they are like addressed at, well, either someone or some category in specific or some countries, but it's not general as the directives and the regulations can be. And then you also have the recommendations and the opinions, which, well, the name speaks for themselves, like recommendations or opinions, so they're not really binding, but it's just a way for the European Commission to take position on some issues. Is everything okay for you so far? Yeah, I don't see any question that is written. So yes, now we can continue a bit with this introduction, just to recall a bit what we've lived in terms of EU legislation on emergency communications. So I'll just do a brief summary of what we have already gone through, basically, since 1991. So that there was a first council decision. So council was the member states that basically decided to introduce 112 and make sure that it works in Europe. So this decision was taken in 1991, and that was completed 7 years after by in a proper directive, the so-called ONP directive that said that 112 should be accessible free of charge from any telephone in the EU. Then we had in 2002 the first Universal Service Directive, which said that which introduced the requirements on caller location to be provided to emergency services free of charge, of course. But so when we talk about caller location in the EU, the first time it appeared in the legislation was in 2002. However, as you may know, there was no strong requirements into like how accurate it can be. So it was implemented, but not always very accurate, actually, this caller location. But so that came first in 2002, and then this set of requirements was completed in 2009 with another directive, another Universal Service Directive, which added some elements on accessibility for people with disabilities, and they introduced the concept of equivalent access between people with disabilities and other end users, and that's the deaf and hard of hearing people especially could also benefit from an easy access to the emergency services. So that came in 2009. Then we had this long period of implementation of such provisions and some legislative fight also here in Brussels, but the achievement was in 2018, the adoption of the European Electronic Communications Code. I guess you must be very familiar with that already, because we as EENA have explained it a lot already, but also I guess for the public authorities that are here in this call, you must be also busy with implementing these provisions at the moment. So I won't explain you once again what the EECC means, but so just to recall very briefly, the concept of emergency calls was replaced by emergency communications to be more in compliance with what the technologies can bring in terms of communicating with emergency services. So not only voice calls, but also video and SMS, etc. So many different ways to communicate. Of course, on caller location, the previous requirements were completed by requirements on the provision of handset-based location information, which can be achieved with the AML technology. Yes, you must be familiar with it now, as well as the implementation of public warning systems based on telephones to alert people on their mobile phone when a big disaster happens. So the two main technologies to do that is cell broadcast and location-based SMS. And also there were better means of access for people with disabilities. This was also completed with the European Accessibility Act. If you want to know more about this, we had a webinar about it quite recently. It was right before the summer, so you can listen to the recording to this webinar on our website. And there's also a document that will be published very soon about the legislation and the technologies to ensure a universal access to the emergency services. So stay tuned for that. And also the EECC made also mandatory the establishment of a PSAPs directory to be maintained by an institution, either BEREC or the CPT, as it is the case now. And so yeah, these were the provisions that are in the Electronic Communications Code. As you know, most of these provisions must be implemented by December this year. So for the countries that are not compliant yet, there's still a few months to be compliant. There's just an exemption for the part and public warning systems, where the deadline is in June 2022. So there's still a year and a half to comply with that, but for all the other provisions, it's December this year. And then I just want to mention that at the moment, we also have important legislation for our sector, the emergency communications. One of them is the e-privacy, actually for the moment is the e-privacy directive. It's a directive that dates back to 2002. And that basically gives an exemption for the emergency services to make use of the caller location and the phone number of the caller and to receive it without having to ask for the consent of the caller, which obviously is a big gain of time of the emergency services. So that is in the e-privacy directive, and that will probably be consolidated in the years to come. I will go through that a bit later. We also have a few provisions on 112 in the roaming regulation. So you probably know this regulation for the great possibility that we have to roam like at home. So to consume telecommunications everywhere in the EU for the price of a national communications. And in this regulation, there is a requirement that an SMS is sent to any people traveling within the European Union to receive information about the existence of the European emergency number 112. We also have, that was adopted last year, a delegated act implementing the radio equipment directive. So this delegated act basically aims at making sure that all the smartphones sold in the single market of the EU will have to support AML. And that will start to apply in March 2022. And then if you want to be able to sell a smartphone in the EU, it must be able to provide location information to the emergency services, which is a very important piece of legislation. Then we have, I just wanted to mention here the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. It's not so much about emergency communications, but more about emergency services in general. I believe it's a great example of EU cooperation. Is basically the possibility to cooperate between emergency services when there's a large-scale disaster. So that makes it, for instance, whenever there's a fire in, let's say, Greece, let's say French firefighters can help and they can send some material to help the Greek firefighters, Spain as well. And so there's all these resources and this human force that can be shared in assistance to fight large-scale disasters, and not only in the Union but also outside of the Union. We saw that many emergency services from Europe went to Lebanon after the recent tragic events a few weeks ago, and this was done through the Union civil protection mechanism. So just wanted to highlight that as like a legislation about cooperation with emergency services, but as a great example of European cooperation. So that is it for the introduction. I just list here a few references if you want to know more about what I have said. You can just, when you receive the slide, you can just click on the links. We have the documents that explain to you the emergency communications and the EU legislative framework. There was a presentation that was done at the last EENA conference last year, and you'll find many legislative texts on our webpage on our advocacy activities. So you can just click on these links and you will be able to access all of this information. So before I review all the things that will be coming in the future, is there any questions to what I have presented so far? Okay, no, I don't see any questions. To my colleague who also, yeah.
Yes, there is one question.
Yes, tell me.
So let me see. It's a suggestion from one of our participants that suggests that we should maybe add the relevant dates that you have mentioned, the deadlines in the last slide that you just listed. Yeah.
Here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so here there's no deadline, so it's except for the delegated acts, which will start to apply in 2022. All the other regulations are already enforced, so that is why there is no. I didn't really specify the deadlines. It's things that are already existing.
And in the previous slide, also, there is another suggestion, and in the previous slide. If you
which
just
is about the EECC. Yes, what I will do is I will add that to the slides before it is shared with you after this webinar, and so you will see everything.
Okay, thanks, Benoit.
Thank you, Taviana. So now we can pass to the future, and let's see what future has for us. As an introduction to that, it will of course not be as direct and as strong as in the past years with the European Electronic Communications Codes, but there will be still a lot of things happening. So it's good to keep in mind also all the different ways that our sector can be affected. And the first way it can be affected, it might sound a bit easy to say that, is the implementation of the EECC. So, well, you know obviously what is in it, and you know that like the deadline for implementation is the 21st of December this year, except for public warning systems, where it's in June 2022. But what is interesting to look at is what will happen there then. So after December 2020, it will be the role of the European Commission to make sure that all the provisions are correctly implemented in all the member states and everywhere in the EU, that it complies with the requirements that are set in the EECC. If a member state fails to comply with the European legislation, then the Commission will launch what is called an infringement procedure, and which will take some time, and there's a special process for that, where first the Commission alerts a country of the fact that it doesn't comply with the EU law, and after some time, if the country is still not applying the legislation, then this can be brought to the Court of Justice of the European Union, and that can lead to economic sanctions against the country. And we see there's like very often there are cases where a country gets a fine for not complying with EU legislation. So that is the risk for the countries that do not comply with the requirements that are set out in the EECC. And then something else that will happen, and that is very important, is that the European Commission will monitor how the law is implemented and what are the issues that are still to be addressed on emergency communications. And based on that, it will be able to adopt delegated acts, which I have just explained is a special procedure to complete the elements of an act. And actually, when you read the EECC, you see that there is clearly a mention to a mandate for the European Commission to adopt delegated acts. So I'm going to read it's the paragraph 8 of the article 109 of the EECC. If you read it, it's in order to ensure effective access to emergency services through emergency communication to 112 services in the member states. The Commission shall, and shall means that it's mandatory, shall adopt delegated acts on the measures that are necessary to ensure the compatibility, interoperability, quality, reliability, and continuity of emergency communications in the Union with regard to co-location solutions, access for end users with disabilities, and routing to the most appropriate PSAP. The first such delegated act shall, once again, be adopted by the 21st of December 2022. That's a very long sentence, but if I try to sum it up, there will basically be a delegated act that the European Commission must adopt on different sectors, different possibilities that are related to emergency communications. The first one is the routing to the most appropriate PSAP. So I put here the special paragraph in the legislation, and it's something that will be interesting to follow when we think about like the new types of telecommunications and the telecommunications based on IP. Maybe the notion of most appropriate PSAP can evolve with the time, and that is what the delegated act might be able to tackle. Then the delegated act will also address issues related to accessibility to people with disabilities, especially to think interoperability of the systems and make sure that this will work when people with disabilities are traveling in other member states, because we know that that is an issue that is remaining. So the delegated act will address or try to address this ongoing issue. And then the delegated act will also look into co-location and how to make sure that co-location is working well and it's well provided to the emergency services in the best possible way, looking at the current technologies that are available. So there will be these delegated acts, at least one, but there might be several, but the first one should be adopted by the 21st of December 2022. So this is really the main thing that is going to affect us in the years to come. It's in the context of the implementation of the EECC, is this delegated act that we will really follow and that will really complete the provisions of the EECC. Is everything clear about this delegated act? I don't see any questions. I'm just going to drink a bit of water before I continue. Okay, still no question, which I hope that means that it is clear.
Benoit?
Yes?
There is just one question popping up.
Yes, I see it now. Yeah. Do we know which act will be implemented first? Yes, so probably what I have described here on the paragraph 2, 5, and 6, it will probably be welcomed together in the same delegated act to address all of this. So there's no one that will be first or others. And I don't see any other question. Okay, so all is clear about that. If you have any doubts, feel free to get back to me after that. But yeah, now I can pass to another file that will be affected us and is already something that is being quite discussed at the moment, is the review of the roaming regulation. I have briefly mentioned a few minutes ago the first roaming regulation, which was adopted in 2012, which first lowered the prices on roaming. But what we know very well is the fact that it became basically free of charge starting from June 2017, and that since then we can phone and use data as much as we want when we are in other countries in the EU. But the down thing, and something that we must keep in mind, is that the regulation will expire in June 2022. So there is a need for another regulation that will replace the current one, because otherwise it will just be everything deleted. So the European Commission is now looking in how we can get this new regulation on roaming, and how to basically address the issues that are still remaining when we are roaming to another country. So what can we expect for emergency communications? Because I'm not going to talk about the prices on roaming, this is something else. But when we talk about emergency communications, there's plenty of ways by which we can be affected by this regulation, because you know that there's still many issues that remain. So there's one thing that will probably remain in the legislation, is the fact that we promote the existence of the European emergency number 112 through an SMS for any person entering a country in the EU. You are, I guess, much aware of this SMS. So that is to remain, I hope. But then this new regulation is also the possibility to address several issues when we talk about emergency communication. One of them is the establishment and the transmission of caller location information to the emergency services. You know that, for instance, those of you who are implementing or have been implementing AML, that it is an issue. So the roaming regulation might address some of these points here, and especially the fact that the transmission of location information should be free of charge for the callers, and even if they are roaming. Then there might be some points about the communication with the emergency services for people with disabilities. We know that today there's still many issues, especially the fact that there's no harmonization between the countries, but it's also the fact that even though there's no harmonization, the people are not aware of the different facts, the different ways to contact the emergency services. Let's take the example of a Belgian deaf person who goes to France. The Belgian deaf person does not necessarily know that there is another number that is for deaf people, well, for everybody actually, to send an SMS to in France, which is 114. There's a big lack of awareness of those means. So the new roaming regulation should address these issues. And also, when we talk about public warning systems, whenever something is required from the visitor to receive the public warning systems, then they should, of course, be aware on how to receive such alerts. So that will maybe be addressed in the roaming regulation. And also, I would like to make a point about the use of non-emergency numbers, because so this falls in the scope of what we can call the value-added services. And sometimes these value-added services, they're not necessarily free for roamers. And so it's important to make sure that, like, let's say, any person coming to Belgium can also contact the non-emergency numbers at the same price as the citizens of a country. So these are the things that are to be addressed in the roaming regulation, and you see that there's many ways actually by which our sector can be affected. So it will be very important to follow this regulation. When we talk about the time frame, so there was just a public consultation that was available on the website of the Commission, and anyone was invited to submit some comments. I guess you received some emails from me about that. EENA has responded to the consultation to address the points that we have just discussed. And you can actually see the EENA response by clicking on the link that you will see on when you receive the slides. And so EENA was not the only one to respond to this consultation, but like many people responded. And now the European Commission is at the moment reviewing these feedbacks. And based on that, the European Commission will publish a proposal for new regulation at the end of this year, around December. And after that will follow, as we saw, some legislative discussions between the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. And the goal is to have a new roaming regulation that enters into force in June 2020 in order to replace the previous text. Is there any question here on roaming? I think this time there is no question. Okay, I can move them to the next item, which is an item that is very heavily discussed here in Brussels. And if you're in Brussels, very likely you will hear about the Digital Services Act in the, let's say, in the EU field, because this is really a big piece of legislation that will be heavily discussed in the months and years to come. So what it is about, actually, first is to modernize the legal framework that we have on online services. Now we make an increasingly big use of online services. But did you know that the legal framework that we have dates back to 2000? And obviously, things have changed a lot since 2000 on the way we use online services. So there is a strong need to modernize the current legal framework, because there has been a lot of issues that have appeared because of the increased use of online services. So that piece of legislation will try to address these issues. And even for public safety organizations, there will be a few things to follow. And it's about so those 3 points mostly. One is the removing of illegal content online. So for instance, the child sexual abuse material and the terrorist propaganda. This is considered as illegal content, and the online platforms might have some responsibility in removing that content. And that's the same for content that is not as such illegal, but that can be harmful, and that is the case for disinformation. So of course, these are big topics at the moment, and the question is about how much responsibility should the online platforms bear in these issues, actually. So that is what is being discussed at the moment, and it's a bit the same time frame as for the roaming regulation. So there was a public consultation that was open until the 8th of September this year. There has been many feedbacks that were submitted. It's really a big topic that is discussed here, and that will be followed probably on the 2nd of December 2020 by a proposal from the European Commission. And then I'm sure that there will be very long legislative discussions until probably around end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And this act is to enter into force after that. But I guess that's important to follow for especially for the law enforcement authorities, because of course now a lot of things are to be dealt online. So it's important to keep a look at that. I'm not seeing any question about that piece of legislation, so I guess I can move to the next one, which is the review of the e-privacy directive or regulation. So if you follow the beginning of this webinar, we have already an e-privacy directive, and you know that we have the general data protection regulation. So you will tell me, just stop it with the GDPR. I know you must be fed up with it, but I just want to mention like the difference that there is with the GDPR and the e-privacy. So the general data protection regulation is, as the name suggests, about the protection of your personal data and the way it is stored mostly, or not actually, while the e-privacy is actually how this data, this personal data, are processed when there is an electronic communications. So the two are somewhat a bit related, of course, but they are quite separated. And as I explained a bit earlier, there is now an exemption for the emergency services to process the caller location and the calling line and identification without having to ask for the consent of the caller when they call the emergency services. So of course, that exemption is to remain in the new regulation. But also what is important is to modernize the definitions and the rules, because the previous directive is from 2002. There were a few amendments in 2009, but still then, like, it's been 11 or 18 years. And of course, the world of telecommunication has changed a lot. And the definitions that are in this directive are a bit old. Also, the scope of this directive is a bit old. So that is why there are some discussions now on how we can modernize this. And as you will see now, it is really taking a lot of time, because there was a proposal for a new regulation that was in 2017, and very quickly the European Parliament came to an agreement about some amendments to that proposal. But the member states who are represented at the Council of the European Union, for now more than 3 years, well, no, just, yeah, a bit more than 3 years, they just can't agree. The item is being discussed several times, but there is still no agreement. And now time is really urging. So there are like a lot of issues that are arising due to the fact that the member states cannot agree on one common position on this text. So I can't really bet on when this will be ready. But once the member states have agreed between them, it is to be discussed with the European Parliament, and then it is to enter into force. So just so you know that this is being discussed, but we can't really know when there will be some agreement. It's important, however, for you, like I'm talking here about the public authorities, to tell the ministries in charge of telecommunications, maybe you are, or your representatives in Brussels, that you really need this legislation to pass, and that the definitions are to be modernized, so that you can really keep that exemption that already exists from 2002. I would like to make some points about artificial intelligence, because this is also a big item that is being discussed in Brussels. And of course, I won't discuss now the many ways that emergency services can benefit from it, but I guess that is something that we are all looking into for the future on the different ways to use that. So I think it's important that you have a look at the white paper on artificial intelligence that was produced by the European Commission earlier this year, and in which the Commission just details the whole strategy about AI for the years to come. So it's something that is interesting to have in mind. Of course, artificial intelligence has already been addressed in many of the previous regulations and laws that passed in the previous years. So for instance, in the General Data Protection Directive. So it was already addressed in the legislation, but now the European Commission is still looking for ways to address the issues that remain, especially in 3 topics. First, the safety and the liability of artificial intelligence, then the ethical framework, and then the intellectual property rights for development of AI technology. So the future legislation will address these following topics. So it's not directly linked to our sector, the emergency services or emergency communications, but it's still quite important to have a look at what will be happening in the future, especially on the safe use of such technology, because I guess this is quite important for us. And same for cybersecurity. This is one of the other big topics that are being discussed at the moment. There has already been some legislation that entered into force last year, actually, the so-called Cybersecurity Act, which reinforced the role of the European Cybersecurity Agency called ENISA, and also introduced a framework for certification of products, like a cybersecurity certification. And this framework is still to be achieved, but there was already an introduction through the Cybersecurity Act, which is already in force. But what will be coming next, and it is actually coming already, is the review of what we call the NIS directive. So it's a directive on, so it's Network and Information System. That's what NIS stands for. And it's a directive that was already voted a few years ago, and that introduced some, made some mandatory cybersecurity strategies for the member states. So it forced the member states to have a strategy on how to tackle cybersecurity problems. Also some teams dedicated to fighting the risks related to cybersecurity. And also that built some cooperation at EU level between the different cybersecurity agencies. So that directive is to be reviewed. There is a public consultation that is currently ongoing with a deadline to respond to it in October. So if you feel like you have something interesting to say about that, just feel free to go to the website of the European Commission and to share your thoughts. If you don't know how to access these pages, email me and I can guide you on how to do that. And that will be followed probably end of this year or beginning of next year with a proposal for a review of this directive, which with, I guess, increased or more important actions required from the member states on cybersecurity, because this is a big risk that is affecting us. And it's important to take that into perspective. And one personal note about that, it's not only the EU who should do something on cybersecurity. I think law cannot address cannot do everything to prevent those risks. I guess it's something that should be taken into account by all the organizations, and that really should be anticipated by the organization. So it's not only about law, but it's also about mindset. So here it's important that everybody has it in account. And I'll make a final note, because like we cannot ignore what has been happening in the past month and what is currently happening basically with the recent sanitary crisis. And we can be quite sure that it will have some impacts on the legislative deployment of the EU, because we saw that while the crisis, especially in the spring, revealed a lot of ways that the EU could just function better to encourage cooperation when it comes to this kind of crisis. So it's a bit hard to say exactly what will happen also, because there is an issue of competencies that I have described in the beginning of this presentation. So once again, here the EU cannot do everything. It can just try to help as much as possible, but it also remains, health especially remains a competence of the member states. This being said, the European Commission has recently proposed an update of the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. There was a vote last week at the European Parliament about that. Actually, this is just to improve the capacities that we currently have with a bigger budget for cooperation between emergency services, and also especially to make sure that we are able to face this kind of health-related crisis, because so far the civil protection mechanism has been used a lot for forest fires and for floods, a bit less for this kind of crisis. So this is just a small update of the regulation that we already have to better anticipate this type of crisis. And then if you followed the speech from the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, last week, you may have noticed that she announced that a European Health Union will be coming. In all honesty, it's a bit hard for me to see how it will exactly happen and how we can talk about the European Health Union, because as we saw, health is primarily a competence of the member states, and maybe it should remain like that. But so the capacity for action of the European Union is quite limited. So what will probably be happening and what we will see in the months to come is more funding for the EU for Health program. So it's a program that finances the improved capacities for healthcare. It was already existing for a few years now, but probably more funding will be available in the years to come. The current agencies that we have, so the European Medicines Agency and the European Center for Disease Protection and Control, will be strengthened, and also probably it has been announced by the European Commission a proposal to create the Agency for Biomedical Advanced Research and Development. So it's something that will be called BARDA, and so that will be coming in the months to come as well. So these are few initiatives to better prepare to fight future sanitary crisis. Of course, it's not perfect and it's not very big, but as I said, it's hard to find the way to really improve this, and I'm sure that also many more initiatives will be coming. What is also to look out for in the future, because of course I couldn't be totally exhaustive in this presentation. It can be that I missed some things, but it can be that also some things will come. So it's interesting to look at, of course, the rollout of 5G. Our sector, we will be very affected by that. It creates a lot of challenges, but also opportunities with the rollout of 5G. So I suspect no more legislation as such will come in the EU, especially on 5G. but of course there will be the European Commission will strongly monitor what is happening with the rollout of 5G, and in case there is a problem, then things will happen. Next year, European Data Act will be proposed. To be honest, it's a bit blurry what will be included in the European Data Act. It's more for the startup and the way we can foster research and innovation on data. So this is something that will be happening next year, and it's something that will be interesting to have a look at, even though it might not affect really directly the emergency services. Also interesting to look at what is happening with drones. There was a new regulation that was adopted last year, so I suspect nothing will come in the next years, but maybe a few actions or a few recommendations will be coming. So it's important to have a look at that, and that is the same for the use of EU space programs, because we know that there's a lot of possibilities by which emergency services can benefit from space technologies. It can be for Earth observation, but also for locating people, calling the emergency services, so of course for search and rescue as well. So there's many ways by which we can be affected by the evolution of EU space programs. So maybe also here no regulation will come, but will be interesting to look at what will be happening, and for sure things will be happening. And we at EENA are trying also to put and to raise the agenda the question of having some kind of harmonization of defibrillators in the EU single market, and make sure that this is a topic. So that is it for my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have some. I see here a question from so Massimo Cristaldi, which is quite interested in the PSAP directory. So the PDF on EENA website, on the psapdir.org website, is there a way to have the list of currently subscribed PSAP? Is there a public list of them? So I'm not sure there is a public list of them. Maybe what I propose, maybe if Freddie McBride, I see that you are in the participants, if you are still around, if you can raise your hand so that I can give you the floor, and maybe you'll be able to respond to this question. Yeah. So we can maybe hear you. Can you speak? No? Then maybe if my colleagues can help in giving the floor to Freddie.
I think you might be able to hear me now, Benoit.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, the PSAP directory is hosted by the European Communications Office in Copenhagen. The organization is the secretariat for the CPT that Benoit mentioned in one of his earlier slides, the European Conference of Postal and Telecommunications Administrations. And as many of you know, this directory was hosted by EENA in an Excel spreadsheet back around 2010, 2011. And based on feedback from EENA members, they thought that the directory might be able to gain more traction and encourage more PSAPs to participate if it was hosted by a public body. And within the CPT, we represent the ministries and regulators with responsibility for electronic communications around Europe, not just the EU, but 48 European countries. So the reach of it would go beyond that as well. So the way we've set it up, it's really a back office support tool for PSAPs. So if you like, it's a confidential telephone directory for the PSAPs to contact each other. So they decide when to use it and under what circumstances, that if they feel it's necessary, based on an emergency call that they receive, if they need help in another country, then they can consult the directory and get contact details and make a call. So PSAPs that participate, and I think at the moment we have PSAPs from around 18 countries so far. It was launched on the 1st of December 2018. So we're still gathering more and more PSAPs, and the requirement that was included in the code, the EECC, has, if you like, had a positive impact on countries joining, because there's, if you like, a kind of a requirement in the spirit of the legislation for that. If anyone is interested, and if you represent a PSAP, you can contact me. My email address is freddie.mcbride@eco.cept.org, and we can provide information. And I actually think there may be an EENA document as well that contains some information on how to go about getting access to the PSAP directory. But as I say, it's a confidential database, if you like. And once a PSAP is granted access, they can go in there and upload their own contact details. And then they have access to download a copy of the entire directory for use within their PSAP. So that's really it. And if there's any further questions, I'd be happy to take them offline. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Freddie, for this point. I guess that is very helpful. So Freddie gave his contact details, so in case you have any question about it, you can just email Freddie. So it's freddie.mcbride@eco.cept.org. And otherwise, we as EENA can also bridge with Freddie if needed. There was another question from Irache Gomez-Susaita. Unfortunately, Irache had to leave, but I can still answer this question because it's interesting for everybody, I guess. So the question was, any legislative work being done about dealing with fake news affecting public safety? And another question, which is how far you think we are from having AI and cybersec regulation covering public safety aspects. So as such, let's group them together. Those three legislation will not directly be aimed at public safety organizations, but of course it will have some implications to it. When we talk about fake news and also, well, the illegal content, of course that affects the law enforcement authorities, and they will be concerned by anything that comes up from this regulation, and also how they can operate with online platforms and basically the platforms on which such content is promoted. So that is the way it will be affecting some public safety organizations, and that is the same for AI and cybersecurity. I don't really think that the future directives on AI will directly affect us, but on cybersecurity, of course, our sector is quite a sensitive sector. So of course, there will be some implications to it, because when we talk about the safety of networks, it's very important to ensure the safety of emergency communications networks. So that will not explicitly cover us, but implicitly, yes, it will. Is there? I don't see any other question. Otherwise, if you have any other question, just feel free to contact me. You have here my Twitter handle or my email address, so I'm happy to respond to any of your questions. Thank you for attending this presentation. I hope it was helpful for you, and now you have a clearer view on what will be coming next. So as the next steps, the slides and the recording of this call will be shared with you tomorrow, and there will be more webinars to come. Maybe Tatiana, if you want to give more information on what is coming.
Thanks, Benoit. Yes, so we will post tomorrow the recording on our EENA YouTube channel, and also on the EENA website, so on the page dedicated to this webinar. So you will access all the material, the presentation of Benoit, and the recording from tomorrow.
So thank you, everyone. I think we can now close this webinar, and just talk to you soon if you have more questions.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.